In this movie, we will take a look at the concept of input validation. Careful programmers will check the values entered into text boxes before beginning the calculations. Validation is a form of self-protection, in that it is better to reject bad data rather than to spend hours and sometimes days trying to find an error only to discover the problem was caused by a user input error. Finding and correcting the error early can often keep the program from producing erroneous results or halting with a runtime error. Checking to verify that appropriate values have been entered for a text box is called validation. Some examples of validation is to check for a range of valid values, to check for required input, this is sometimes referred to as a presence test, and to check for specific data types. We will now take a look at some examples of input validation in the Visual Basic environment. I have loaded in the Visual Basic environment a sample program that will allow us to see how some of these techniques are used. In this first example, I have a prompt to enter a name and a text box to accept that name. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm simply allowing the default name of textbox1 to be the name of the text box. As you can see, I have a button whose purpose will be to check the data, that is, to validate the correctness or the presence of the data. In this case, we want to make sure that the name is entered. So if I run the program, and if I enter a name such as John, and click on Check Data, as you can see, a message box appears that is being produced through my code that the data is okay to allow me to proceed. Now, in a real program, you probably would not see this message box. You would simply proceed with the program and perform the next step. But again, for this demonstration, I have a message box there to illustrate that. If, on the other hand, I fail to enter a name, therefore leaving the text box blank, and then try to proceed, you then see a different message. This time it says required text is missing. Once again, you would then be able to prompt the user to correct the error or maybe stop the program, but the point is you're stopping or you're pausing the program to allow the data to be corrected. Let's take a look at the code on this sample program. As you can see, a simple if statement is being used to perform the validation. In this case, the textbox1.text is being compared to a null string. A null string is an empty string. Therefore, it is represented in code as quotation marks back to back with no spaces in between. Make sure you do not enter a space in between the double quotes. If you did put a space, you're not comparing it to a null string, but rather you're comparing it to a blank space, which is not the same thing. The operator is the not equal to operator, which is the back-to-back less than and greater than symbols. So our if statement reads, if textbox1.text is not equal to a null string. Now what does that mean? If it's not equal to a null string, that means it is equal to a string. So therefore, this is where our code would exist if we want it to proceed. On the other hand, the else is then capturing the false condition of our if statement. Our if statement will be false if the text box is left empty. So therefore, we're displaying an appropriate message, in this case required text missing, and we're alerting our user to the fact that they have failed to enter some required data. I'll now return to the form and make a modification to demonstrate another technique of validation. I've now modified our sample program to allow the user to enter a value less than 100. Once again, we'll use our Check Data button to validate the data. So at runtime, if I enter a value such as 90 and click on the Check Data button, again, since we're looking for a value less than 100, the data is deemed to be okay and I'll allow the program to continue. If, on the other hand, I enter a value such as 200 and click on Check Data, the message box, invalid data, value entered is too high, is displayed. Let's take a look at this code to see how this validation takes place. Once again, you'll see an if statement, but this time I'm using the integer.parse function to examine the textbox1.text and compare it to 100. If it is less than 100, note the less than symbol, then the data is said to be okay. If, on the other hand, the if statement fails, therefore the else condition comes into play, the message box is the value entered is too high. So once again, we've caught bad data before any other processing is taking place. Notice that the if statement is comparing the contents of the text box to 100, less than 100. So if I were to run this program and enter exactly 100 in the text box, that data is also deemed to be invalid, since 100 is not less than 100. We will talk about multiple validations soon, but one word of caution here. When you're checking for more than one invalid situation, make sure to check for blanks first, that is, the null string, since a blank field will throw an exception with a parsing method. For example, if you reverse the order of what we just performed in one single block, the invalid data would be compared before any data that was required would be checked for first. You always want to check for the presence data first. We'll look at other examples of performing multiple validations in a separate movie.